Alright, welcome to the Strange North channel. This is the Gangs of Toronto Part 3 video of a 3-part series. And if you get some value out of this one, then you might enjoy parts 1 and 2 that I've already posted. As a quick note before I get started, all information presented in this video is based on publicly available information. And honestly, you could do hours of content on many of the criminal organizations in Toronto's history. But this will be more of a general overview of some of the major groups for people that are interested in Toronto's gang history. And if you haven't already, then please consider subscribing to my channel. I typically upload something new at least once a week. And I'm going to get started. So in my previous Gangs of Toronto videos, I didn't cover any Asian gangs, but they have been very prominent in Toronto. In fact, Toronto Police has a specific Asian organized crime task force dealing with this issue. And I'm going to start with the Triads. You've probably heard of them. Compared to other criminal organizations, they definitely keep a low profile, and there's not nearly as much information on them as other groups. Essentially, Triads are Chinese transnational organized crime syndicates that are based in Greater China, but they have major outposts in countries having significant overseas Chinese populations, including Canada. Technically, triad groups originated in Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan specifically, while criminal organizations in mainland China are often referred to as black societies or mainland Chinese criminal groups. Like the Italian Mafia, the triads largely grew out of political instability in their country. The triads originated from secret societies in the 1700s, branching off from the secret Hung Society, which was also called the Heaven and Earth Society, and they have an interesting history of their own. These groups were initially organized to overthrow the then ruling Qing dynasty, which was the last imperial dynasty in China. The triads were involved in underground and revolutionary activities, and over time they developed into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. They are largely based in Guangdong, which is China's richest and most populated province, and this region produces a massive amount of products. Tons of fentanyl and other drugs are manufactured and processed in Guangdong and then smuggled into Canada through triad groups. They also supply Mexican cartels with chemicals that allow the manufacture of things like fentanyl and methamphetamine, and the triads have many connections with the cartels. In my Gangs of Vancouver 2 video, I talked about how triad groups in Vancouver have been involved not only in drug smuggling, but significant money laundering through that city's casinos and real estate market. They also use a network of underground bankers who help hide this flow of money. This triad laundering operation has been so successful that it is internationally referred to by investigators as the Vancouver model. And of course, the triads have not limited their Canadian activity to Vancouver. There are many sources that say the triads have been operating in Toronto since the 1930s. Earlier this year, a man named David Asher, who was a former senior investigator working with the United States State Department, the CIA, and the DEA Special Operations Division, stated that triad groups were working with the Chinese Communist Party and operating significant North American money laundering networks through a command and control structure centered in Toronto. And much like Vancouver, Toronto's real estate market is thought to have been significantly affected by investment from large criminal organizations, including the triad groups. And so within Canada, triad groups are definitely some of the most cautious and low-key organizations in the country, and they are thought to have strong ties to the Mexican cartels and the Chinese Communist Party. So multiple sources say that the first triad group established in Toronto was Shing Wo. This group originated in Hong Kong, and they are thought to have established a chapter in Toronto in the 1930s. Internationally, the Shing Wo has a reputation as being one of the most violent triad groups, but they have mostly maintained a low profile in Toronto. Another major triad group is Yee On. This was founded in 1919 in Hong Kong, and they are the largest triad group in the world. They are said to have connections with Italian Mafia groups, and they have been active in Toronto as well as cities across Canada. You also have the 14K triads, and overall they are the second largest triad group in the world. They are said to have very strong ties with the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico, and they have become one of the most prominent triad groups in Canada. You also have the Luen Kung Lok triads. They are one of several individual triads making up the Luen group, and they have been especially involved in illegal gambling, protection rackets, and extortion. They are one of the smaller triad groups, especially compared to Yee On and 14K, but they've had a strong presence in the city of Toronto. And then there's the Big Circle Gang, also known as the Big Circle Boys. This group was established in the prison camps of China in the 1960s, before they relocated to Hong Kong in the 1970s. The Big Circle Gang is now a transnational organized crime syndicate that spread to Canadian cities throughout the 1980s, and they are known to have been very active in Toronto. By the late 1980s, the Big Circle Boys were notorious in Toronto's Chinatown area, area for home invasions, robberies, and kidnappings. One man in particular who joined the Toronto Big Circle Gang in the late 1980s would go on to become one of the biggest gangsters in Canadian history. Tse Chi Lop was born in Guangzhou, China in 1963 and moved to Toronto in 1988 with his fiancée. He had joined the Big Circle Gang when he lived in China, and he continued his association with them when he moved to Toronto. Shortly after he settled in Toronto, even though he was only a mid-level member of the Big Circle Gang in that city, he negotiated a business partnership with the Toronto branch of the Montreal-based Rizzuto crime family. He arranged to smuggle high-purity and low-cost heroin into Canada from the Golden Triangle for distribution through the American Mafia's networks into the US and Italy. The Big Circle Gang dominated the heroin market in Toronto, and the Mafia expanded their distribution area in the US. Over the 90s, the FBI and RCMP became aware of his activities, and they attempted to arrest him in 1995. But he had moved to mainland China by that time, and this region does not have an extradition treaty with the United States. But he would travel to Hong Kong in 1998, and that year he was arrested by a joint operation between the Hong Kong police, the FBI, and the RCMP. He was extradited to the United States at the end of that year, and he would eventually plead guilty to one count of conspiracy to transport heroin. He was sentenced to 9 years, but served only 6 years at a low-security prison in Ohio. He was then deported to Canada to complete a 3-year supervised release in the country. Following the end of his supervised release in Canada in 2010, Tse Chi Lop relocated to Hong Kong with his family in 2000, and he formed a new organization that was called Sam Gore, otherwise known as the Company. He was also able to leverage his diplomatic skill to bring together criminal groups that were previously at odds with each other. The 14K, Sun Yee On, and Shing Wo groups would ally under the new Sam Gore organization, and he would also successfully ally with the Yakuza in Japan and various criminal organizations in Australia. By the late 2010s, Tse Chi Lop had become the biggest drug dealer in the Asia-Pacific region. He controlled 70% of Australia's meth supply, and he was the dominant distributor in the Japanese, South Korean, and Philippine drug markets. At its peak, the Sam Gore Gang had a 40 to 70% share of the nearly $90 billion worth Asia-Pacific drug trade. Another prominent gangster in Toronto's history was Asau Tran, otherwise known as Johnny Tran. He was born around 1952 in Vietnam and immigrated to Canada in the early 1980s as a refugee from the Vietnam War. After arriving in Canada, Tran would move to Los Angeles, but he was quickly deported back to Canada. Under Canadian immigration law, Tran wasn't allowed to be sent back to Vietnam, as he could have faced the death penalty in that country. Tran would stay in Toronto, and he quickly formed a gang of over 100 people through active recruitment and assimilating members of existing gangs in the city. They became known as Asau's Boys, and they developed significant notoriety in Toronto in the 1980s. They were said to be involved in gambling, protection rackets, extortion, and allegedly they operated a juvenile prostitution ring. In 1983, Asau Tran and 2 others were arrested for a high-profile Chinatown shooting that left 1 person dead and 2 people wounded. But ultimately, the 3 men would be found not guilty for the shooting due to insufficient evidence. In 1986, Tran and 27 other members of the gang were arrested, and 88 charges were laid against them. The charges ranged from extortion and illegal gambling to weapons possession and organizing prostitution. This operation significantly disrupted the gang's operations, and they began to decline. Finally, on Friday, August 16th of 1991, Tran was gunned down alongside his girlfriend on Dundas Street in downtown Toronto. He was shot more than 30 times in the face and knees, and police believe that this was a result of unpaid gambling debts. 1 week prior to his death, during a TV interview with reporter Isabel Bassett, Tran stated that he predicted he would be shot, since Vietnamese gang leaders rarely reach the age of 40. So I mentioned the different triad groups that have been active in Toronto and that they have traditionally been very low-key. They operate at a high level and frequently use smaller street gangs to conduct their street-level business. 2 gangs in Toronto that reportedly have links with the triads are the infamous Asian Assassins and Chin Pack, and these gangs have been involved in many high-profile conflicts throughout Toronto. The Asian Assassins were formed in the 2000s in Toronto's Alexandra Park, and Chin Pack was formed around the same time in nearby Regent Park. These neighborhoods have significant housing projects and large immigrant populations. These areas have seen a lot of poverty and neglect over the years, and there's been a lot of criminal activity associated with Alexandra and Regent Park. The Asian Assassins quickly found themselves in conflict with Chin Pack. On March 30th of 2013, Asian Assassins member Michael Nguyen was gunned down in a high-profile shooting outside the Yorkdale Shopping Center. The next year, on January 8th of 2014, another Asian Assassins member named Premier Huang and his girlfriend were shot to death in their vehicle in Richmond Hill. They were killed by a man named Timothy Lee, who had ties to the Chinpak Gang. Timothy Lee would later be sentenced to life in prison after a lengthy and elaborate police undercover operation to elicit a confession. A couple months later, on March 25th of that year, 64-year-old Nok No was shot dead in his Toronto home. However, the intended target was No's son named Tan No, who was a member of the Chinpak Gang. 4 years later, on March 19th of 2018, Tan No would be shot to death at a Toronto bowling alley in a highly publicized shooting that saw an innocent bystander killed. Between 2011 and 2018, Toronto police suspect that at least 11 murders are connected to conflicts between Chinpak and the Asian Assassins. Major police operations dubbed Project RX and Project Battery have led to dozens of arrests and multiple convictions of gang members, everything from drug and weapons trafficking to prostitution, murder, and assault. They are thought to still be active to some degree in Toronto, especially around Alexandra and Regent Park. So in 1983, there was a massive anti-Tamil pogrom that erupted in Sri Lanka during a time of massive social unrest and civil war. This caused many Tamil people to flee Sri Lanka, and they often had little in terms of resources and opportunity. During the 90s, multiple Tamil street gangs were formed across Toronto, with the most prominent being VVT and AK Kanan. The VVT gang was founded in the early 90s in the west end of Toronto, especially in Etobicoke and Old Toronto. It was thought that the VVT gang had hundreds of members and that they were involved in various criminal activities such as drug and weapons trafficking, fraud, counterfeiting, and extortion. The VVT gang had an ongoing war with another Tamil gang in the city. The AK Kanan gang was formed in 1992 in Scarborough, and an ongoing conflict between the two groups apparently started at a party in 1993. The two gangs would be in constant conflict after this, with many fights between the two groups, including a well-publicized shootout between the two gangs over turf in 1996. On December 27th of 1997, a 19-year-old University of Waterloo student named Kapalan Palasantharan was shot and killed at a donut shop in Scarborough. He did not have any gang connections, and police believe that this was a case of mistaken identity. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was a very high-profile event in Toronto. No one was ever charged in the shooting, although it was widely thought to be related to gang war between VVT and AK Kanan. In June of 1999, a car with multiple occupants was shot at several times by another vehicle. One person was killed and several others were wounded, and police suspected that this was related to the gang war between the VVT and AK Kanan. 2 days after this shooting, another 3 teenagers were shot in their car in Markham, and 16-year-old Sandy Ebrahim was killed in the attack. Police stated that this was also caused by conflict between the two groups. The Toronto police estimated that between 2000 and 2001, Tamil gangs in Toronto were involved in at least 50 shootings throughout the city. In the early 2000s, the Toronto police began a series of raids against the two gangs. Canada's view on gangs had started to change due to the war on terror after 9/11. Canadian authorities increasingly believed that the VVT and AK Kanan gangs were funding guerrilla factions in Sri Lanka, and they started viewing these gangs as terrorist cells, and fairly quickly most members of the two gangs would be arrested and deported back to Sri Lanka. But these gangs are said to still be active through its younger members across the Greater Toronto Area. Over the years, Toronto has had various Latino and Hispanic gangs, although these ethnic groups are not as large as the city's other populations. The early 2000s would see the arrival of one of the largest Hispanic and Latino street gangs in the world, officially called the Almighty Latin King and Queen Nation, but they're more commonly called the Latin Kings. The Latin Kings were founded in the Humboldt Park area of Chicago in 1954 by Ramon Santos. Over time, they grew and developed into a large criminal organization and spread across the U.S. The Latin Kings eventually expanded outside the U.S. into Ecuador, Spain, and Italy. Ecuadorian citizen Flavio Mauricio Reyes Criollo established the first Canadian chapter of the Latin Kings in Toronto in 2003. They stayed under the radar for the first couple years, but they were involved in a highly publicized event in 2007. On June 22nd of that year, Latin Kings members attacked 4 people at a subway station in Toronto. One of the victims was a 13-year-old who was a former member of the gang, and he was partly paralyzed in this attack. Later that year, Toronto police launched Project Flush, which was dedicated to investigating the Latin Kings in the city. In 2008, Toronto police raided 2 apartments in the city and seized the gang's manifesto and membership list. In 2009, the culmination of Project Flush played out with a series of raids across Toronto, and 9 members of the Latin Kings were arrested. In July of 2010, 4 members of the gang were deported from Canada, including Toronto chapter founder Flavio Reyes Criollo. Ever since then, the Latin Kings are thought to have been largely inactive in Toronto, having been heavily targeted by significant police countermeasures. Another large Hispanic gang that you probably heard of that is currently active in Toronto is Mara Salvatrucha, more commonly referred to as MS-13. This is an international criminal organization that started in Los Angeles during the 1980s. The gang was originally formed to protect Salvadoran immigrants from other gangs in the Los Angeles area, and over time they grew into a more traditional criminal organization. Many MS-13 members were deported back to El Salvador after being arrested. This would facilitate the spread of MS-13 to Central America, and they are now active across the United States, Mexico, Central America, and Canada. And in general, MS-13 has a reputation for being one of the most violent street gangs in the world. I'm sure you've heard a little bit about the recent crackdown on the gang in El Salvador. In terms of their activity in Toronto, they are thought to have established a small presence in the city sometime during the 2000s. MS-13 expansion into Toronto was reported by the National Post in 2005, and they quickly found themselves on police radar. In June of 2008, following an intensive 5-month investigation, Toronto police conducted a series of raids across Toronto and arrested 21 members of MS-13, laying 63 charges. They were mostly drugs and weapons charges, but several members of the group were accused of plotting to murder a member of the criminal justice system in Canada. In 2016, a man named Rene Pacheco was arrested in Toronto for attempted murder. His charges would eventually be dropped, but while incarcerated, he would brag to a Canada border agent that he was actually an MS-13 gang member. He was ordered by a Canadian court to be deported back to El Salvador in 2018, but this decision would quickly be halted in another court, with the reason being that he would face significant danger if he was deported back to El Salvador. Just last year, in February of 2023, a 65-year-old man walking his dog was shot multiple times in the village of Schomberg, just north of Toronto. He was severely injured but luckily survived the attack. Later that year in June, 3 suspected members of MS-13 in Toronto were arrested and charged in the attack, which was believed to have been caused by a case of mistaken identity. And so this definitely isn't the biggest gang in Toronto, but MS-13 has a reputation of being one of the most violent street gangs in the world. They are thought to still be active in Toronto, and their presence in the city is a concern. Now I'm going to talk about some of the Italian Mafia groups that have been active in Toronto. Internationally, these are some of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. Mafia-type organizations have been active in Toronto for many years. By the early 1900s, the notorious Black Hand Italian extortion rackets had followed Italian immigrants to Toronto, as was common in most North American cities at the time. In a much publicized case in 1907, a wealthy Toronto woman received a letter demanding $500 paid to, quote, the Brotherhood of the Black Hand, while warning her if she contacted police or media, she and her husband would be murdered and blown up. During Prohibition, Toronto became a major base for bootlegging operations into the United States, and it saw an increased presence of Italian-American organized crime. The most important gangsters in Toronto in the 1920s were Rocco Perri and his common-law wife, Bessie Starkman, who smuggled alcohol into the US and heroin into Canada. From May to June of 1929, an undercover RCMP officer named Frank Zaneth became the first Mountie to ever go undercover in the Mafia. He posed as a drug dealer from Montreal and was able to buy considerable sums of drugs from 3 of Perri and Starkman's dealers. This led to one of Toronto's first large-scale drug busts, and a large amount of money, drugs, ammunition, and guns were seized. In 1931, in the United States, Lucky Luciano organized the Commission, which was the new governing body of the American Mafia, and in this arrangement, Toronto and the rest of southern Ontario was assigned to Stefano Magaddino of the Buffalo crime family. Rocco Perri remained active for years in Ontario during Magaddino's reign of influence, but from 1944 to 1945, Stefano Magaddino would murder Rocco Perri and several of his associates to consolidate power. In the years following the Second World War, much of the organized crime activities in Toronto was the work of 3 mafia families based in nearby Hamilton. These were the Musitano, Lupino, and Papaglia crime families, and I'm going to cover them in more detail in the Gangs of Hamilton video down the road. A prominent figure in Toronto's early mafia years was Michele Rocco, also known as Mike the Baker, and later referred to as the Godfather of Toronto. Rocco was born in Calabria, Italy, and joined the 'Ndrangheta as a young man. The 'Ndrangheta is essentially an Italian mafia-type association based in the Calabria region of Italy, very similar to La Cosa Nostra of Sicily and the Camorra gangs of Campania. Michele Rocco would move to Canada in 1952 and settled in Toronto in 1953. He would open a series of bakeries, coffee shops, and ice cream parlors, and quickly became a very successful businessman. Michele Rocco maintained close ties to the Lupino crime family in Hamilton and the Catroni crime family in Montreal. By 1962, Rocco established a Canadian Cremini Condomini, which is an annual meeting of the Ndrangheta, and a Camera di Controllo, which is an overarching Ndrangheta governing body. He did this with the assistance of other prominent Italian-Canadian gangsters, such as Giacomo Lupino, who founded and led the Lupino crime family in Hamilton, and Rocco Zito, who was a high-ranking member of Michele Rocco's group. This organization would become known as the Saderno Group or the Saderno Mob, as most members came from the town of Saderno in Italy. By 1971, Michele Rocco was considered to be the most powerful gangster in the city, and the media would dub him the Godfather of Toronto. It was thought that Rocco initially answered to the Buffalo crime family, a much older mafia organization based in Buffalo, New York. After the death of Stefano Magaddino, who was a prominent leader in the Buffalo mob and very influential in Canada, Michele Rocco would establish close ties with Paolo Violi, who was the de facto boss of the Catroni crime family in Montreal. Rocco was also known to have close ties to Paul Vulpe, who was a Toronto-based member of the Buffalo crime family. Michele Rocco would eventually die of cancer in 1980. Michele's son Dominic took over as boss of the Saderno group briefly, but he would be murdered in 1983 on the order of the Musitano crime family in Hamilton for violating cocaine trade agreements. Another Ndrangheta group based in Saderno, Italy that became integrated with the group in Toronto is the Camiso Ndrina. The Ndrina is the basic unit of the Ndrangheta, and it's made up of blood relatives. Girolamo Camiso was murdered in 1948, and he left behind 3 sons, Rocco Remo, Cosimo, and Michele Camiso. The 3 Camiso brothers would move to Toronto in 1961, and they quickly became associated with the local Saderno group in that city. The brothers were initially associated with Michele Rocco, the Godfather of Toronto, but they later moved closer to Rocco Zito during the 1970s. Rocco Zito was an advocate of having close ties with the Montreal criminal groups, a stance that was shared by the Camiso brothers. By the end of the 1970s, the Camiso brothers had developed a criminal enterprise that, quote, rivaled the best of the Sicilian mafia structures existing in the United States, and which was, in terms of pure muscle and audacity, one of the most powerful mafia groups in Canada, end quote. They imported and distributed heroin with Vancouver organized criminals, printed and distributed counterfeit money across Canada, engaged in contract killings, and operated a vast extortion network across Ontario. In the Gangs of Toronto Part 2 video, I covered the Satan's Choice Motorcycle Club in Toronto. A prominent former member of that club named Cecil Kirby also worked as a hitman for Cosimo Camiso from 1976 to 1981. In 1986, Cecil Kirby published an autobiography entitled Mafia Enforcer, in which he described working for Cosimo Camiso. Quote, Cosimo wasn't tough. He was homicidal. He'd kill you as soon as you were looking at him. If he thought you were crossing him, if he thought it was good for business, or if he thought you insulted him or his family. The lives of other people meant nothing to him, end quote. In the 1980s, the Buffalo crime family operated in Hamilton and Toronto, and a prominent Toronto-based member of the Buffalo mob was named Paul Vulpe. I previously mentioned that he had been closely linked with the Godfather of Toronto, Michele Rocco, in the 1970s. However, in the 1980s, Paul Vulpe cheated 2 of the Camiso brothers in a real estate deal, and they vowed vengeance against him. Rocco Remo and Cosimo Camiso met with the Buffalo Mafia, and they would hire former Satan's Choice member Cecil Kirby to kill Paul Vulpe. However, this plot failed due to Cecil Kirby becoming an RCMP informant, and he gathered enough information to convict Rocco Remo and Cosimo Camiso of multiple crimes, and in 1982 they would be sentenced to 14 and 21 years in prison respectively. This would be a major event in Toronto's mafia history. Members of the city's Ndrangheta were typically very effective in evading arrest and conviction. However, all of this did not save Paul Vulpe, and he would eventually be killed in 1983. By mid-2019, police in Italy and Canada were convinced that the Toronto-based Ndrangheta had become so powerful that they had the authority to make decisions not only in Canada's underworld, but also abroad, even back in Saderno, Italy. On July 18th of 2019, York Regional Police announced the largest organized crime bust in Ontario's history, which was part of an 18-month-long operation called Project Sindicato, which was coordinated with Italian police. 500 officers raided several homes and businesses across the GTA and arrested 15 people associated with the Ndrangheta in Toronto. Police also seized 27 homes, 23 cars, and $2 million in cash. Additionally, this investigation also led to the arrest of 12 members of the Saderno group in Italy. Those arrested were said to be closely associated with the Canadian branch. However, this massive operation fell apart in court after most of the charges against the accused gang members were stayed due to investigators improperly using wiretapping, and it was claimed that there were significant breaches of solicitor-client privilege. Most of the individuals arrested walked free, and all of the property that was seized by the police was ordered to be returned, with the exception of illegal possessions. The Ndrangheta in Toronto remains a prominent force in the city's criminal underworld, and they have played a major role in the city's gang history. And then to finish off, I'm going to talk about the Russian and Eastern European gangs. They really started picking up in Canada in the 1990s. Russian organized crime can really be traced back to bandits and thieves in the Russian Empire. But it wasn't until the establishment of the Soviet Union that certain thieves in law emerged as leaders in prison groups in the gulags, and they would develop a well-defined code of honor. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, these bratvas, or Russian mafia groups, quickly spread to North America. American attorney Louis Freeh, who was the head of the FBI from 1993 to 2001, said that the Russian mafia posed the greatest threat to the United States in the mid-1990s. In 1995, Canada's Criminal Intelligence Agency reported that Russian gangs specializing in money laundering, weapon smuggling, and contract murders have been establishing themselves throughout Toronto and the rest of Canada. The Criminal Intelligence Agency also stated that they threatened the stability of the economy and speculated that vast sums of their criminal profits were being laundered through Canadian banks. That same year, Toronto police organized a distinct task force to deal with Eastern European organized crime. In 1997, Toronto police launched Project Osada 1, which saw the arrest and deportation of one of the most powerful Russian criminal leaders in Canada, named Vyacheslav Sliva. Later that year, police launched Project Osada 2, which was a 2-year investigation into Russian gangs in the city. This culminated in 1999 when more than 300 officers from Toronto Police, the RCMP, and the OPP raided properties across the GTA and arrested 38 people being suspected members of a Russian crime group. This group was charged with credit card fraud, immigration visa fraud, drug trafficking, and manufacturing counterfeit credit cards. The RCMP superintendent at the time stated, quote, "This was the biggest arrest of Eastern European criminals in North America," end quote. The police found that the Russian gang wasn't as organized or hierarchical as other groups in the city, but they stated that this Russian group had formed links with other traditional mafia figures and Asian gangs in Toronto. And so Russian and Eastern European gangs are definitely a presence in Toronto, and they have a reputation for using technology in very sophisticated ways. Russian and Eastern European gangs use Toronto as a base of operations for local and international crimes, and they often collaborate with outlaw motorcycle clubs and Italian Mafia groups, and they continue to operate in Toronto. And that's going to wrap up Gangs of Toronto Part 3. If you got some value out of this one, I definitely recommend checking out Parts 1 and 2 if you haven't already. Over the next couple months, I'm going to be posting videos looking at the gang history in Montreal, as well as Hamilton and Ottawa. If you want to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee, and there's a link to that in the description below. And if you haven't already, then please consider subscribing to my channel. I typically upload something new at least once a week. Thank you for watching, I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Strange North channel.